Okay. So, I'm hoping everyone can see this. Maybe if you could unmute and just somebody tell me if you can.
Yeah, we
Yep.
can see it.
Okay, fantastic. Because I don't want to be talking to myself and then it turns out I've got a blank screen and nobody can hear me. Okay, so this course is the first module in the Level 3 Foundation Diploma in Health and Social Care. Now, the whole purpose of the Level 3 is to give all of the students a good overview of the types of roles, responsibilities, communication requirements, and policy and practice that you're expected, the standards you're expected to be able to know about and demonstrate in the everyday work that you do. So, as I said, I'm a chartered health psychologist and I'm an associate fellow with the British Psychological Society. And that basically is because I've been working in and around the health service for a very long time. So today, the objective of all of this course is to give learners, i.e. you, the underpinning knowledge, the understanding and the skills that you're going to require for a career in the health and social care sector. Now, that could be as a support worker, a senior support worker, or as a care assistant. Now, when I first started working back in the day, many moons ago, I worked as a nursing assistant and I was pretty much thrown in at the deep end. I didn't know anything. There was no kind of course like this that would explain, some of the things I was expected to be aware of or to follow in my everyday job. And I really just kind of had to work it out as I went along. So in some ways, I'm a bit jealous of the fact that you have this course, because it certainly would have been helpful for me when I started doing, my career in health, because it was really a case of, if you were lucky and you found someone who could help mentor you and explain things, then you could learn. But if not, it was really more of a kind of just trial and error and stumble through. So this course is basically to fill that gap, so that when you're working in these settings, you have a much better sense of what's expected of you and the types of conversations and kind of policies that underlie a lot of what you do. So what are the learning outcomes? What are you going to be able to get at the end of this? Well, you want to be able to understand the working relationships in health and social care. So this is just for today's module, so that you can, get a bigger, wider, broader overview of just the types of people that you'll come across in your everyday work, and also how you interrelate with these people. And you're going to understand the importance of, sticking to your job role, and what has been written down as the tasks that you have to undertake, and why that would be important. And then we're also going to touch on partnership working. And partnership working is incredibly important in the health and social care. How you work not only with people that, your client, but also other professionals, and sometimes even people that are working in different sectors. So that would be, say, for example, between healthcare and social care. Now, these are two completely different systems, but often the clients that we work with will be being provided with support in both of those systems. So it's often important to know, who are our counterparts on the other side. So let's start with this understanding working relationships in health and social care. So we're going to explain the roles and responsibilities. So what does it mean to have a role? What does it mean to have a responsibility? And then we're going to explain in which way these working relationships are different from a personal relationship. You know, we have relationships throughout our life with lots of different people, but when we're talking about these types of relationships, we actually mean something different, and it's really important to know what those differences are. And we've also got, we have to explain the role of the regulator and the advisors. Who are these people, and what do they do, and why should we know about them? Why is it important to know about these particular bodies? So, okay, the roles and responsibilities in health and social care, setting the types. Okay, so in social care, we will come across people, for example, adult social workers, support workers, home care assistants, care managers, case managers. And often this is things like people who are working with care of the elderly, or in this case, learning disability. So back in the day when I first started, I was a nursing assistant, and I worked in healthcare, but I worked with learning disability, because at that time, everybody who had some sort of learning disability was housed mainly in hospitals. So they would be in very big institutions, and it was under the control of the health service system. About the 1990s, the policy changed, and what they kind of realized was actually, people with learning disabilities, they had the right to have, more freedoms. They had the right to experience more normal everyday life. And what happened was the big hospitals began to close, and all of the people that had been in those institutions moved out into smaller supported accommodation, and it was taken over by social care, and quite rightly so, because these people may have physical issues that they need support with, but on the whole, that's not the reason they need care. They need care to help them with daily living activities and to support them in having a highest quality life that they can have. So this would be a very typical client group, somebody who has a learning disability or care of the elderly. This is a client group that a lot of people who work in social care will be involved with those two main groups. And then we have healthcare. So healthcare, we have, again, a range of different jobs. We have people who are like nurses. You may have come across the general practitioner. So, so if you are working in social care as a support assistant, maybe what you need to do is you're going to need to take the person that you're looking after to go to see the doctor. So they'll be going to the general practitioner. There is occupational therapists, and that would be somebody who will help that person do daily living tasks. So it's not about work, it's to do with things like how capable is this person to look after themselves? Are they able to cook? Are they able to clean? What are their care needs? And they're particularly doing assessments for example, for someone who has dementia. So we want to check, are they safe in their environment? Do they need additional support? The psychologists like me, so that's somebody who's dealing with mental health, or it could be to do with head injury, or even in the case of dementia, doing some sort of assessment to see what is the function and understanding of this individual. Psychiatrists will be predominantly in mental health. So you will have, in community mental health teams, if someone is suffering from some form of mental illness, or they have, they have something significantly amiss with their mental well-being, then the psychiatrist would be the person who is in charge of the care package in terms of their medication and ensuring that this person is on, if they need the appropriate medication. And you also, one of the professionals that you're likely to come across is the speech and language therapist. And they're really important because often our clients are very vulnerable and they may have issues to do with communication. So the speech and language therapist is often called in to be able to assess and to be able to support in our work, to be able to ensure that we're able to take the views, take the ideas that our clients have, and we're able to help them communicate whatever their needs may be. Okay, so I'm just gonna come out for a second. So has anyone got any questions quickly? Has anyone got any questions about so far?
No.
No? Okay, so in your jobs, Faluko said he's in care, he's working in care. So what about you, Angela? What sector are you in?
Yeah, actually, I'm working as a healthcare assistant now.
Okay,
I'm working
and
in the hospital. I have worked in a nursing home. I have worked living care. I have done support.
okay, so you've got quite a wide range of experience, and have you worked with the professionals that I've mentioned? Any of those professionals?
Yes, I have worked with OT. I have worked with a psychologist. I have worked with a speech and language therapist. I have worked with nurses, of course.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So
I haven't
mean,
worked with GP. That's the only section left for me.
yeah. Well, the thing is, when you work in the hospital environment, often because you're not working in the community, the GP isn't. He's occasionally he comes to visit a client on a patient on the ward, but generally they're under the care of the hospital doctors. So, if you start to do more work in the community, for sure you'll start to come across the GP.
Yeah, when I did a living, I was working because I was the person supporting the person in living. So I was working with the GP, but I haven't worked in the sector itself.
Yeah. Okay. Well, the thing is, it's good to know that you've got lots of experience working with a variety of different professionals, because one of the things that we find is, we're going to come across a wide range of different people doing different jobs, and what they think their roles are, what their responsibilities are. In order to make sure we provide the best care, it's really important that we know what is their function and how can they help us in order to help our client. So just jump through this. Okay, so how are these working relationships different from personal relationships? So if anyone has any ideas, can you shout out, say, how do you think they're different? Let's have a chat.
Yeah, Angela responding now. I think
Yep.
there quite a difference between working as individual and working as a team. Working in those sectors, you're working as a team. You reason together, contribute together, prepare goals together, work on the goals and see if the goals is not workable. You can change and do other implementations that will help. But when you're working alone, it's just you. But out there, you are reasoning together, having other experiences, learning from others, and they're learning from you.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, that's exactly it. Now, and that's why really these relationships are really different from a personal relationship. Okay, so we have these relationships between colleagues. So a possible relationship, we've got our manager and the worker. So our line manager will be able to tell us what we're supposed to do and what they, so in my case, I had a charge nurse, but the charge nurse ran the ward. So beneath her were the registered nurses, and the registered nurses then told the nursing assistants kind of what they needed done. So there's very much a hierarchy of people who are making sure everything is done, all the tasks are met. And then there's somebody who you hope will take on a supervisory role. So they're going to be able to tell you, this is good practice, this is not so good practice. And it's, I would suggest to anybody working in these types of field, Find somebody within your working environment who you can see that their practice is good, and learn as much as possible. As Angela says, you know, when you have these types of people, then you know they're the ones that are going to share you their knowledge. They're going to teach you the things that you need to know, and they're going to be the people that if you have a problem, you can go and say, you know, I don't know what to do here, or this thing has happened that is I'm a bit distressed about. Because often when we're working in this type of intimate care, at times there's going to be things that we find that we're out of our depth, or that we feel that is distressing. So it's really important that you know who the person is that you can speak to. And then we have the relationships between the different professionals. So you're going to have social health and social care, and a legal advocate. Now, a legal advocate is somebody who, when you have an individual who maybe has a diminished capacity to give consent for whatever reason, you know, maybe dementia, so they're losing functionality. It may be learning disability, so they can't fully understand what they've been asked to make decisions on. Then they often have someone who will be appointed to be their legal advocate or guardian. And that person will be the person that when you're making decisions, you speak to them, and then they speak on behalf of that person. Okay, so this can cause, this can cause tensions, because perhaps, the health and social care worker thinks that this would be the best thing, whereas the legal advocate has to make sure that any decision that's being made is in the best interests of that person. So it's best to see this relationship as something that is really about protecting your client, just as you are trying to do. So will with this individual. And they've got all of the different relationships between the health and social care workers. So, as Angela says, she's worked with a variety of different professionals, and that's going to be your experience in whatever care sector you work in, whether it's health or social care. You're going to come across people who are doing different jobs from you, and that means that how they look at an issue or how they look at a certain set of challenges will be coming from a different perspective from maybe you are. And that's all well and good, because sometimes we overlook things, or we get caught up in how we see the world, and having someone offer a different opinion can often be incredibly useful. We have relationships within teams. Now, the most common is the multidisciplinary team. So this will be a team that's made up of lots of different types of disciplines. Okay, so in health, it's very, very common in the community that you will have the speech and language therapist, the occupational therapist, the psychologist, the nurse, the dietitian. They will all be working together to help one client. Now, everybody's bringing their own knowledge, their own theory, their own practice, and they come together, they make discussions and care plans in order to make sure that this individual is getting the best possible care. And they also have the care planning team. So the multidisciplinary team is delivering the service generally, but the care planning team will be the people that sit together and do the assessment to say, okay, let's say Mrs. Jones, she's 86 and she's had a fall, she's broken her hip, she's going back home. What is she going to need when she gets there to ensure that she's safe, she's healthy, and that her basic everyday care is being maintained? And that will be the care planning team. And then we've got professional relationships with others. So it's not just within our working environment that we have these conversations, but we also have to have these relationships with the families and the friends of the individuals. Now, at times, again, that can be what we think would be best for the individual isn't necessarily what the family wants to hear. So, for example, when, Mrs. Jones is 86, she's had her fall, but we also discover that maybe, her mental health is going downhill. And now she really is at a stage where, she maybe needs more full-time care that the family themselves cannot provide. Now, that's a very difficult, painful conversation to be having with anybody, you know. So it's a lot of the time when you're dealing with the families or the friends of the person you're caring for, it's going to be an emotional a conversation. And we have to be mindful, because for us, a lot of the time, you know, it's work. We may have a relationship with some of our clients more than others, but on the whole, it's not going to have the same impact it will on us as it will to, you know, say the partner or the children of, or the parents of the person that, you know, we're having to do these case plannings for. So how are they different, these relationships? How are these not the same as a personal relationship? You know, we have relationships with our friends, we have relationships with our family, but these relationships are not the same. And why and how is that? Okay, so first thing is, these relationships work within agreed guidelines, legislations, and codes of conduct. And that means that every discipline, every type of role or responsibility that you undertake in your job in a care capacity, it has at the back of it legal requirements. And usually there'll be the legal requirements of, this is what we have to do. You know, we have to follow these particular legislative rules. Then we have guidelines, and the guidelines can be practice-based. So then, for example, the Royal College of Nursing or the Royal College of Physicians, they will say, this is our guidelines on best practice for this particular issue. And then we also have what are called codes of conduct. And the codes of conduct are basically, here are the ethical guidelines by which a professional has to work in agreement to. Okay, so these codes of conduct, they're on the whole, they're fairly similar across all of the disciplines, but each of the roles that we take, you know, if you're working in care for social care, they will have a set of guidelines and codes of conduct, just as they do within in the health service. So if you're working as a nursing assistant, your code of conduct will probably be within the Royal College of Nursing, which says these are the standards by which you have to interact and behave when you are with your client. And what do you need to be aware of? Well, confidentiality. No, this is not, you know, we can keep secrets when we are, you know, we're talking about a family or a friend member, and we say, oh, we're keeping a secret. But confidentiality is a lot more official than that. And a confidentiality is that we will not go out and share. So just imagine that you are working on a ward and someone comes in, and that person happens to be the neighbour of your cousin, for example, and they've come in and they've had a fall, and, you know, something untoward's happened. For example, it's been noticed that they have bruises on their body, and there's a question that, hey, perhaps something, you know, has been happening to this individual at home that is cause for concern. And you meet your cousin, and, you know, you say, oh, so and so is in the ward that I'm on. You can't do that, okay? Because whatever happens in your workplace, you are bound by the confidentiality guidelines and codes of conduct of confidentiality. So even if it's somebody that you know, and it doesn't even have to be as dramatic than that, it could just even be, you know, a neighbour, she's come in at the hospital, you can't go home and say, oh, you'll never guess who I just saw today in the hospital, because anything that happens in your work environment cannot be discussed out with. Okay, now it can even be as difficult as discussing issues with other professionals. Okay, so when we work in multidisciplinary teams, it's kind of agreed that the information that we share with our team members is all covered by confidentiality. But, there are certain issues that, if, for example, when I'm doing therapeutic work, there are certain issues that I don't necessarily share with my colleagues because they're private and they may not be directly relevant to the care they're provided. And that's why we have these information sharing protocols. We have an idea of, okay, this is the stuff we share, this is the stuff we don't. But really, for your purposes, the golden rule is do not share anything out with of work. Okay, now the reason being that if, say, God forbid, you tell your cousin about Mrs. whoever who's had this bruises on her body, and your cousin then goes and says, oh my God, you've never heard, and then it gets back to that individual, you can be in some serious trouble. Okay, you will be under investigation, and then what can happen is you can be disciplined and sacked, because the confidentiality part of it is almost like a golden rule that operates within health and social care. And we also make these agreed care pathways. So, when we're working with other professionals, what we do is we will set out the steps that we think this individual is going to need, and between the different professionals, we track out what we think is going to be, the best recovery for this individual as he or she moves through this pathway. And like Angela says, you're also working towards a common goal with a shared purpose. So, there's kind of like an old story in the health service that when nurse and assistants start on wards and they have maybe, there's an older person and they've fallen and they're struggling, what they'll do is they will the novice worker will try and help that person. And when I say help, they'll give them something to drink, they'll move the cup, and then the occupational therapist will come in and they'll be very upset about this, because what the occupational therapist is doing is trying to move the person to independence. So what they're doing is they're going to make slightly more challenging situations so that person has to just stretch themselves a bit. So when we're working in a team setting, when we're working in these professional relationships, it's very important that everybody knows why we're doing certain things and what the purpose is. So it may be that, on day one, the lady or the gentleman needs help to go to the toilet, but on day two, the occupational therapist is saying, okay, I want this person to stand on their own or get themselves up without support, and then you can help them to the toilet. But it has to be spelled out, or then we can, kind of have some problems in terms of people working at crossed purposes. Now, I'm just going to stop a second. I just want to, okay, yeah. Oh, somebody went in. No, okay. Okay, so I'm going to continue. It was just somebody else coming in. Okay, so.
Hello, teacher.
Hello, nice to see you. Okay, if you can mute your microphone, don't worry. This has been recorded, so you'll be able to get a copy of it and the bit you've missed. Okay, so now we're going to explain the role of regulators and advisors. Okay, so what is a regulator? Well, a regulator is an official body that has the legal responsibility to oversee service quality. So what you're doing, when you're working in health and social care, it's not a free-for-all. Okay, you cannot just decide, whatever you feel you want to do. That seems like a really good idea to you, or you have a particular strong opinion about something, so you're gonna talk to your patients about it. there is a legal framework which oversees the quality, and that includes your practice. So it's really important that you have an understanding of what that is, because those guidelines, those structures mean that you're not ever going to be in a position where someone is saying, hey, you've broken the rules. And it's also to make sure that everyone is kind of working in the same direction. And over the time that I've been working in health and social care, that has certainly become more of an issue than it was before. And the reason being that, certain things happened that were really quite distressing. So there was quite a few scandals to do with health. There were scandals in social care about quality of care. There was things that were happening in hospitals. And when these things broke into the news and the public became aware of them, there was really a kind of, a shock and a horror that, wait a minute, who is really making sure that, the people who are providing care to people who are honestly the most vulnerable in our society, who's making sure that they're not just doing what they want and how they want? So the regulators came into being. What are they responsible? They're responsible for the quality. They're responsible for training standards and professional conduct. They make sure that when somebody goes into hospital, or when mum or dad is poorly, and maybe they have dementia, that there's going to be a quality of care that makes sure they're safe. Has someone got their microphone on? Could they possibly mute it? Thanks. It's just I can hear it in the background. Okay, so do you know of any? There's quite a few. There's the Care Quality Commission. So these are the people who go around and they do an assessment and an evaluation, and they check that basically any care home is meeting standards, that it's it's clean, that it's structured, that it's well run, that the people that they're caring for are safe, and they will go in as a team and they will make sure that this particular facility is of a standard that is able to care for these particularly vulnerable individuals. NHS Improvement is another one, and they basically do a similar role. They make sure that the quality of the care within NHS is okay, that it's of a standard, and if any complaints are being made, that they'll be investigated to ensure once more that when your loved one or even yourself, it goes into an NHS facility, that they're going to be receiving the type of care that you would wish for them. The General Medical Council specifically deals with doctors, and if a doctor is accused of misconduct or is seen to be doing a type of medical intervention or behaviour that is below standard or is not evidence-based, then the General Medical Council will become involved and they will investigate. For nursing, so nursing assistants as well, Nurse and Midwifery Council, they will be they'll be registered on this, and they will be the ones that if there's an issue, the nurse will be called up to the council to account for themselves. And that's why it's really important that you know what the codes of practice you're expected to work by, the standards you're expected to work by, so that you have this understanding in the background. Dentists have the General Dental Council, and for psychologists, OTs, a range of other associated health professionals, they have the Health and Care Professional Council, and they will basically check the training, accredit the training, and then, if someone has passed those standards, they can then be added to their register as a practitioner. So that's the regulators. What about the advisors? Okay, so this is somebody who's the body that's going to advise on service design and delivery. So when we have, so years ago, diabetes was really what we were talking about was diabetes type 1. Okay, diabetes type 1 was when there was a catastrophic collapse of the production of insulin in the body. So that all of the services were designed to cope with in-hospital treatment forms. Okay, so everybody would generally go to the hospital, and they would be, taught how to do their blood monitoring, their blood sugars, and they would have to use injecting insulin. Over time, though, what happened was, as our diet and our lack of exercises kicked off, what happened was we had this huge explosion of type 2 diabetes. Now, type 2 diabetes is more of a lifestyle issue. So, if you're eating a lot of sugar, a lot of, fizzy juice, kind of convenience food, you start to put weight on. Eventually, it interrupts the production of insulin. Now, it's not quite the same as the cannot produce insulin, which happens in type 1. It's basically, it's a result of lifestyle choices which happen over time. Now, what happened was there was this huge amount of population increase. So suddenly we had to think about how do we deliver the services for this population. And what happened was, instead of now diabetes predominantly being dealt with in a hospital setting, everything moved out into the community. So suddenly we have, in a GP practice, they would have diabetes clinics where people would go with a diabetes nurse. So she would monitor weight, she would do education on diet and exercise, and everything was kind of redesigned because this population, this clinical population, suddenly appeared, in much greater numbers than they'd ever been before. So it would be an advisor that would look at that and say, okay, we need to redesign services in order to meet this need. They make sure that the service standards are done well, so that what you're going to get in this redesigned delivery is going to be of a high standard. So instead of me now going into the hospital for my diabetes, I'm still going to get, a really good service, even though I'm just going to my local GP, to a local clinic. Okay. And they also really put an emphasis on having patient and client voices in service planning and design. Back in the day when I started, patients weren't really listened to. And I can remember, doing service planning issues and having these types of meetings. And, clinicians were actually quite nervous of having patients' voices heard, because what they thought would happen was the patients were going to be very critical of services. They were going to be very focused on one issue, and that really they had nothing to add. What actually happened was that when the patients or the client, the client voices were at the table when they were making these decisions, it sort of changed the attitude of the professionals, because suddenly the professionals remembered that actually they were dealing with real human beings. It wasn't just numbers. It wasn't just a case of, okay, let's open this clinic, let's do that, let's shut that. It was suddenly, the impact of their decisions were right in front of them, and people were able to tell them, this is what your decisions are going to do, to me or my family or, the client group that I represent. So it actually had a very humanizing, and it was quite a positive move. So I've got Health Watch England, they will go in and they'll be having a look to make sure that what's happened, the standard is good and that it's responsive to patient client voices. The National Institute of Health and Care Excellence. So again, they're looking at statistics. They're making sure that they're putting the money where the need is. So if you have a sudden outbreak like COVID, suddenly we are having to think about, okay, how can we quickly design and deliver new services that didn't previously exist. Many years ago, I was involved in acute services review in Scotland, and that was on the back of a massive, it's called a norovirus. It's basically a winter sickness and vomiting and diarrhea, like epidemic. So what happened was, because the people would go in and they had this horrible gastric bug, but then all the staff caught the bug. So then there was nobody left to care for the people who were ill, because everybody was ill. So after that, what happened was, in Scotland, there was a massive review of, okay, should something like this happen again, how would we manage it? Okay, because prior to that, it was kind of like, this was the first time it had happened. Every time the health service reorganizes, something new will pop up, and then we have to say, okay, we maybe managed to get through that situation, but what are the lessons learned, so that when we come to planning for the future, we're in a better position to respond for this. And then we have the Scottish Intercollegiate Guidelines Network. So that's the Scottish version, and they're the SIGN guidelines. And again, they look at the big numbers and say, hey, we think that maybe for dementia, this particular type of medication has been shown to be effective in the early stages. Yes, we're going to put the NHS money into, making this drug available. They can often be a bit unpopular, because sometimes what happens is, when you have a client or a patient who is very desperate, they can't quite understand why isn't this medication being funded? Because they want to do anything possible to help the person they love. So someone has to make those decisions, and these are kind of the places where these decisions are made. Okay, so we're going to look at, why is it important to adhere to the agreed scope of work? So why do we have to stick to the job role? Okay, why is that important? And how to access the agreed ways of working? Where are we going to find out where all this information is? And how to contribute to the quality assurance process to make sure the people we're looking after have a positive experience, because each and every one of you going into this setting then becomes part of this bigger mechanism, this bigger organism, which is health and social care, and you become part of that. And part of your role is to ensure that you are also feeding into, okay, what are the changes that may be needed in order to help those who are under your care. Okay, 2 seconds. I think I heard a beep. I don't know if somebody's come in. Yeah. Oh, I don't know. It's going in and out. Okay. Okay, so there we go. Okay, back on this. Okay, so why is it important to follow agreed ways of working? Anybody got any ideas? Anyone want to come off mic and say, why do you think it's important?
I think it's very important because each organization, each hospitals, each facilities have their own policies. So you need to follow the policy of that particular organization, either nursing home or hospital or GP sectors. So you need to follow and agree with their policies, so that if anything goes wrong, the policy will be able to protect you.
Absolutely. Part of it is about protecting yourself, because if you kind of go off and do your own thing and then something, untoward happens. So, it may have nothing to do with what you've done, but if you haven't followed the policy, then when they do the critical incident investigation afterwards, or when they kind of do the what happened, and you haven't followed that policy, then the focus is likely to turn on you. And the other thing is that you need to make sure that you're protecting the client or the patient. So if everybody's doing their own thing, and nobody's talking and nobody has any process by which they make sure that, that they're following this way of working, then it's a big mess. Okay. So everyone ends up working at cross purposes, and essentially the person who's stuck in the middle, which is the client or the patient, is going to be the one who experiences the mess. So imagine that I go in and I say, oh, I'm going to do, a desensitization program. Okay. A desensitization program is when someone has a lot of phobia and they're very scared, and I'm going to help them work with their phobia, and I've got this lovely plan of how I'm going to do it. And then the next day someone else comes in, and instead of following the plan, they just take the person out and put them in front of a dog when they're terrified of dogs. Okay, so it was a very sort of basic illustration, but it can happen if people don't know what it is that everybody is going to be doing, what their roles are. There's just a lot of space for a lot of things to go wrong. And when you're working in health and social care, that is certainly the case, because there can be so many systems that are involved with working with the client. So there's a lot of their reporting systems, there's a lot of bureaucracy at the back of everything we do. We have to write a lot of notes, we have to do a lot of record keeping. But if we're not agreeing how we communicate that, or what our roles are, then things can go quite horribly wrong. So we need to know what a job role is. And that's where you first start. And it's the legal title for your job, and it outlines what your duties are. So when you get your contract, it has to say this is what you do, so that you're not going to be getting asked to do something that is beyond your training or your capability or even your comfort zone. Okay, so it can be quite an interesting thing when you first start working, because often it feels like you get thrown in the deep end. It can be quite overwhelming. You're suddenly having to do things that maybe you've never done before, and at times it can almost feel like, okay, is this my job or is this not my job? Now, most of us have some sort of internal sense of comfort, and it's very important to be in touch with that, so that if you find that you're being asked to do something that you think, this is well out of my comfort zone, I really feel quite anxious and nervous about what I'm being asked to do, then you go and you speak to your manager. But really, it should be quite specific in your job role what your duties are. I can remember when I was younger being asked to take out a patient from a mental health institution, and I was supposed to take them to the park or something. I can't remember. I think it's town. And then later on, I found out that this person was subject to a Scottish order. Okay, so this person had been released on a particular order, and the reason being that this man had murdered his wife. Okay, so he was now in this particular institution, but I didn't know why he was there. So when I found out that actually this person, maybe at this point was categorized as low risk, there was no problem, but I didn't know. And had I known, I might have said, look, I'm not sure if I have the skill set to be able to do this role. So, a lot of the time it is about really being able to say, where am I, what's happening, am I in my capacity or am I out with my capacity, and not being in any way distressed by thinking, hey, this is more than I can handle. It's perfectly normal. What happens when when someone has worked in these environments for a very long time, they become desensitized. So what they take for granted as, anyone can do this, they tend to forget that for somebody who maybe doesn't have as much experience or is in a new environment or a new role, that what they find overwhelming is probably a lot more than what, you know, the person who's been doing it for, say, I don't know, 15, 20 years. So where are you going to find it? It's going to be in your job description. It's going to say, okay, you are going to help with daily care. You are going to be doing things like supporting the client in their, you know, daily living activities. It's going to be in there, and it's going to specifically say, you know, what you're expected to do. Now, often they're a bit vague, but when you have your interview, when you're talking to your line manager, when you're going for any sort of assessment, you just, you know, you have a conversation about it, and you say, okay, what does this mean? What would this look like? What is it? You know, what would the activities that you're requiring of me? What do they really mean? Why is it important? Okay, so it's important because it's going to outline your legal responsibilities. And I know I've kind of mentioned this protection of yourself for legal responsibilities, but really, to be honest, this is why this course is really important. You become part of a system that has some very defined legal status, some very defined codes of practice, some very strict guidelines on how you're supposed to behave, how you're supposed to interact with, you know, clients professionally, with other professionals. And part of that is your job spec will say what you're supposed to do and what you're responsible for, and also what you are not responsible for. So it will outline what the limits of your, you know, your role and responsibility is, and you need to know that, so that if anyone asks you to do something that, you know, isn't in your job spec and you feel uncomfortable doing because it's beyond your capability, you know, you keep in mind that if you do it and something goes wrong, then you will be held legally accountable. So it's really important to make sure you stick within the boundaries of what you're expected to do. Now, it's not something to get scared about. It's not something to get paranoid about. It's just to make sure that you really are aware of it, so that it's going to create almost a limit should anyone else within, you know, your job try and get you to do something that you're uncomfortable with. It's going to help you understand the expectations of the job, and, you know, that means that what is it that you're seen to be able to do. So they're not going to ask you to do, you know, a full care plan package until you're at the point where you have got enough experience to do that. But it may say that it wants you, there's an expectation that you can design everyday planning, you know, life events or quality of life interactions. So that might be part of it, and that they want you to start thinking about how do you care for this client or this patient in that way. And it's also going to be how you get your job performance appraised. Okay, so it's going to give you a list that says this is what you need to do. These are the areas that we want you to concentrate on. These are the things that, you know, you need to be able to demonstrate that you are good at. Now, why is that important? Part of it is because if you're planning on having a long-term career in health and social care, those roles, you know, that job performance is going to kind of show you the structure and the pathway that it's going to encourage you to follow in order to be able to develop, you know, a long-term career in health and social care. And that's the issues of, you know, being able to get promoted, getting more responsibility, and it works as a kind of step-by-step process. Okay, again, going back to the legal part, it's important to stick to the job role because you will be accountable. Your practice is accountable within your duty of care, and your duty of care is basically the overarching principles which are saying that you must care for this individual or this client, this patient, and that you have a duty to do it. And the duty of care involves doing, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4 roles. These are your duty of care. So you're going to be measured against that, and your practice will be seen accountable to that. So if you if your job is to be able to make sure that old Mrs. Smith has, is clean and tidy, but you don't help her get bathed, or you don't help her change her underwear, then you will be held accountable, because that will be in your job spec that this is the type of activity that you need to do. And they'll be able to say, well, hey, Mrs. Jones is dirty, she hasn't been washed, she's disheveled, you're failing in your duty of care, then you will probably face disciplinary action. And again, this professional commitment and your professional boundaries, when you're working with people who are vulnerable and they are distressed, they will often push you to do more, because they confuse the role. They'll think that you are a friend and you are not a professional who is there to do a job. Now, you may have a fantastic relationship with your client. You may, really get on well with your client, but they are not your friend. And that can be very, very difficult at the beginning, because, we're there, and most people in care work, in healthcare work, they're there because they want to help. So, but part of it is being able to realize that, this isn't a friendship. This is not a personal relationship. There is this boundary, and knowing your job role will help you maintain that professional boundary. So, okay, why is it important to follow agreed ways of working? Well, agreed ways of working are policy and practice which have been decided and signed off as the best way to do something within your service context. So I used to work for a managed clinical network in Scotland, and it was to deliver services for babies who, when they were born, we couldn't tell if they were boys or girls, because something had gone wrong in the differentiation of their their genitals. Now, when I began, there was no best practice. Okay, there was no agreed policy. So England did it different. Hospitals around Scotland, which is very small in comparison to England, they all did it different. And what happened was the group got together in Scotland and they made the decisions. This is the best practice. Now, with time, what actually happened was that best practice then became the European best practice. Okay, so it gradually started from a very local issue to something that became then, a European agreed way of working. And it helps, because what happens is then, anybody who goes to get a service, they know they're going to get the same service. And what happens is they also know that service has been designed based on the best evidence. Okay, so caring for these children, what we know, this is the best evidence, and our services are now going to be designed based on that. And that would be an agreed way of working. So what are they for? Again, it's all about making sure everybody who's doing this type of work, is delivering this service, knows what's required of them professionally, legally, and it's going to be making sure it's delivered this high quality service. Now, before this massive move towards these agreed ways of working, partnership working, pretty much everybody was doing what they wanted. So in one health board, they'd be doing it this way, and another health board, they'd be doing it that way. Now, that still happens to a certain extent. You'll still, see people talking about postcode lottery prescribing, but it's a lot less than it was before. Okay, so it's not perfect by any means, but because there's now these standards, if an area decides not to follow these standards, and it's a great way of working, then, and something goes wrong, they're then going to have to face, well, why haven't you signed up to this, or why haven't you been following this? And it also means then that, say if you move from one local authority to another local authority or health board, they should be delivering the services in a more or less similar way. So what would be an example of an agreed way of working? Well, current policies and procedures. Every department you work in, every care home will have a policy about how they do something. It may be something as simple as lifting and handling. So being able to get, going on a lifting and handling course, making sure that this is the correct way to take, an elderly person out of the bath. It may be a policy on assisted communication. It may be a variety of things. It may be what do we do in the face of challenging and aggressive behaviour? What is our policy? But there'll be a lot of policies, and generally these policies will be to do with the most commonly faced challenges within this particular working context that you're in. And there will be, how do we implement, discussions of this is how we put into practice these agreed ways of working. So it's all very well having a lot of policy, but we then have to say, okay, well, how does this look in the real world? How do we make that happen? So as I said, moving and handling, health and safety is a big one. How do we make sure that, for example, I worked in locked wards. Why were they locked? Because, there was a risk of the patients that I worked with generally harming themselves, not so much other people, but themselves, because they were at a more moderate risk. Things like, okay, do we have kitchens locked? Do we make sure there's no access to cookers? There's a whole range of, health and safety issues that, or even as simple as something like bathing. Does it have to be same gender? Do we have to make sure that there's not, an issue of sexual assault? So all of these types of questions about how do we keep these vulnerable people safe, they will be getting put into some sort of policy. Infection control, we saw that with COVID, everybody having to wash their hands, social distancing, wearing a mask. It was like infection control, on a grand scale. But within the hospital, that's why they have wash your hands everywhere. That was already there. Alcohol wash when you go you work in a surgical ward. Putting the masks on, learning how to wash your hands in a specific way. These are all parts of those policies and procedures, and got our responsibilities. Another one is data protection and information sharing. This is kind of like this is the modern day equivalent of confidentiality. So say that I've gone to the doctors and I've told them something very personal, and then they write it down on my medical record, which is now, kept electronically. I certainly don't want my email address kind of going out to the local, medication drug company to say, hey, why don't you try this medication? And I don't want the possibility that somebody can hack into the NHS information databases and find all my information. So there's policies on how do we share it, how do we store it. And safeguard. Now, safeguarding is very much about when you have somebody who is not able to make decisions for themselves, or they are, they have somehow got their capacity to make those decisions are compromised. And we still have to make sure that somebody stands in proxy instead of that person, to make sure that they are not being abused or manipulated or taken advantage of in any way. So especially, for example, when you have people who have perhaps got, dementia, there may be issues to do with who has, control over their money. When we have learning disability, they're often being cared for by a care organisation or a carer, and then we need to have processes and procedures that are in place to make sure that, their financial handling is done in an ethical and an honest way. and just generally security, making sure that where they live, how they live is safe. Now, the last one, the anti-discriminatory practice and equal opportunities inclusive working. These are kind of some of the backbone of the big legislation. And I'm not going to say too much about them today because we're gonna cover them in another class. But basically, within the health and social care environment, we are not allowed to discriminate based on gender, race, sexuality, religion, age. There's a variety of things that we can't, reduce the opportunities or possibilities for anyone that we work on based on these categories. And really, we shouldn't be doing it based on any category, but these ones in particular are very much and the background of a lot of the ways we have to think about how we interact and how we work in partnership with our clients. Okay, so partnership working. We have to understand why it's important. Okay, so we're going to look at the benefits. What do we get from it? Why should we bother? Some examples of when does it happen that's best practice when social and health and social care work together, and describe some of the ways that we can help improve these partnerships. So, complexity. We are dealing generally with not straightforward client groups. If I have a sore toe and I don't know, maybe I've cut my toenail and I've cut it into the quick and I've got a sore toe, and I go to the GP and the GP, says, oh, okay, you've got a bit of an infection here, take some antibiotics and straps up my toe, and that's it. Okay, a couple of weeks later, I've forgotten about my sore toe. Our clients generally aren't like that. They're coming with a whole range of needs. So, Mrs. Jones, who had the fall, who's 86, she's in the hospital. There's a query about, is she safe at home with her dementia? She's, beginning of dementia. Can she look after herself? Can she look after her finances? What's her mobility? Is she safe to cook anymore? Is she fully understanding the decisions that she needs to make? Now that is already bringing in a variety of different professionals, okay? Because now we've got somebody who their complexity of needs is just exponentially increased. With learning disability, that's often, that complexity is there from the beginning, and these clients are often are in the system from fairly early on in birth. We also then have education involved because they're having to go to school. How do we manage, their educational needs? We have occupational needs. So, generally when you're working with a learning disability population, when you get the case file or you get to see it, it's usually enormous because they have been, they've been in the system and they've been in multiple systems for a really long time. So like I said, different disciplines and services to work together to provide the necessary care. As a psychologist, I might be able to help with, making sure we understand what level of cognitive functioning an individual is, but I certainly can't help them with, daily living, helping them, like assessing them for how capable are they to make their own lunch, for example. So that's a different role, and a different discipline does that. Funding and resources. When we work together, often what happens is the funding and the resources are pooled. So, a new project will appear because often what happens is as client needs change or we become aware of different aspects of provision that need, services will change in response. Very slow in health and social care, which is why a lot of the voluntary organisations are often appear to quickly and rapidly provide those services. However, when health and social services do get them they're kind of their themselves organized and work together, then what happens is they can pool the money from the two different sectors to create the project that sits in the middle, and then it means that they reduce costs because they're not working separately. They're not, it's not like two services are trying to provide the same service. They're actually working together, and there's become a move towards multi-sector teams that specifically deal with things like, an elderly patient going from hospital back into the community. How do we get them home? So they work with the health staff as well as the social care staff who are looking for housing and appropriate accommodation. They basically provide more choice. So, when you start to work together, patients and clients find that they're able to, help with the design and the delivery around their particular needs. And then that variety means that they're going to pick something that fits them better. So before, there may be services that were existence, but when clients and patients weren't actually asked what they needed, then, it wasn't necessarily that the services were designed to actually for what the patients wanted. Quality. When professionals and services work alone, they've been found to have lower quality in their provision. Okay, a couple of reasons probably. One is that, when other professionals are watching you, you have a tendency to pull your socks up a bit and make sure you're, working to a higher standard. But also, perhaps less cynically, what also happens is when you are working with professionals from different disciplines, different sectors, it's interesting, okay? It's a learning event. So what happens is people get quite motivated because then they're learning things that they wouldn't normally come into contact with. So, that in itself can be our kind of a motivation to improve what you do in your practice. Now, it also comes on the back of, there was some pretty horrendous events happened in the 90s and the early 2000s in the health service. And generally speaking, it was kind of lone practitioners doing what they wanted. And, often what happened was that there was nobody to challenge them because, for example, I don't remember if you remember Harold Shipman, who was a GP, and he was also, a serial killer. Now, he was working in a one-man general practice, which meant there was nobody overseeing his work. There was nobody auditing what was the death rate within his particular practice. And, over time, when they went and investigated, that's when they saw that statistically he was off the chart. So these sorts of things are horrendous when they happen. But as a result of them, one of the protections that they put into place was, okay, let's wipe out this doing it on your own lone wolf type of attitude, because there's something in the protection of being in a group for governance and quality assurance. And knowledge, like I say, it's really good to be able to share your information and learn different ways. My work was always in multidisciplinary teams. I always learned something new. I always enjoyed sharing what I knew. Partly just for the pleasure of doing it, but also because you could see that it meant that people were able to provide a better quality of care for the client, and that was in itself quite a rewarding type of activity. So, the importance of professional relations. You are going to have relationships with team members, colleagues, other professionals. You have to learn how to mobilize them, utilize them, and keep them in a healthy standard. You will come across people whose work in practice you do not like, who you do not agree with. You may have personality clashes. hopefully you will never come across somebody who is out and out, a toxic individual. However, I would be amiss if I said they don't exist. So you have to learn to be able to recognize, is this person, is it just a personality thing, or is there something really quite, difficult about this individual? And how you deal with it then will come off from that. But really, I would say that in my experience, 98% of the people that I work with that were my colleagues, I got on well with. They might not have been my closest colleagues, but on the whole, I had really good working relations. And that's, something that you can go into this environment knowing that you're going to have people that enjoy what they do as well. They have your back, they want to share, they want to learn, and they've also gone in with the same type of values as you, that they want to look after and care for, the people that you work with. And you're also going to have to make sure you have these professional relationships with the families, the individuals, and other people important to the individuals. Now, at times these can often be the people that you have the most difficulty with, because emotions run high. So, the client may be very scared. So that makes them incredibly difficult, even to the point that they can be aggressive, that they can be abusive. So you really need to make sure you understand what the policy is. If you're in that situation, no one has the right to abuse you, even if they are scared or in pain. So you need to make sure that you understand what is the limit of what you need to kind of put up with. It's a lot different of somebody who lashes out once and they're terrified, as opposed to someone who is chronically bullying you and making you feel very uncomfortable. So I had a client that I had to do an assessment for, a neurological assessment, and this particular individual, had an issue with women, really did. And when my colleague was there super with me, doing supervisory work, this man was fine. But as soon as my colleague went, this man got very, very aggressive. Now, I just didn't have to put up with that. So it became, I'm not working with this client. Okay. There is a limit in which you can say, okay, if I feel so safe, if I feel uncomfortable, or if I feel that I am being put upon, then you're quite within your right to go to your line manager and say, not for me. But on the whole, as I say, 30 odd years of experience, I can probably count in one hand the time that I've had a particularly difficult client. Family members on the other hand, can be a bit more problematic, because they can be, their demands are slightly different. They're angry and enraged on behalf of their loved one, and often they are the ones that are trying to navigate the system, and I've had many clients, say to me, I am so tired, or family members saying, I'm so tired of having to go to the doctor, to the next health professional, the next social professional, and tell them the same story. Can they please not read the notes? Can they just not read the notes? And it's quite understandable that, when somebody is caught in that system, and a system that doesn't seem to really fit the needs of the person that they're caring for, they can get very tired, very fractious, and very, and very aggressive. Often what I find is with those clients, the best thing is just to listen and admit, what they're experiencing is really quite unpleasant, and that you're doing the best that you can, because often it's really just them having the sensation that somebody is actually paying attention to them and sees their point of view. So you've got to learn about communication. You've got to know what the agreed ways of sharing the information are. How does everybody on the team make sure that everybody else knows what everybody's doing? you know, if you work on shifts, you will write handover notes. There's usually like a handover meeting where the new people coming on shift will be told what happened on the last shift in case, you know, something has happened of particular interest, or really maybe just to pass on, you know, keeping up to date. So those structures, those processes are generally pretty much embedded in the everyday. And you need to know what the boundaries, you know, what is this need to know basis? How do you share? Where are the lines? And you need to also be aware of power sharing and empowerment. A lot of the time about communication, especially with clients, as you know, I mentioned before clients didn't get to say much, and often when we are in our, you know, a carer's role with a client or their family member, we hold the power. Okay, so you know, we're the person that gets to decide when they eat, when they bath, when they go to bed, what services they get, and that can be, if it's used inappropriately, is you know, can be very, very unhealthy. So in your role, what you're trying to do all of the time is make sure that the person you're caring for has the capacity and the ability to take part in the decision making as much as possible, because at the end of the day, it's their life, it's not yours. So, you know, if you imagine that you were in a hospital, it was your mum or your dad, you would certainly want to be part of the decision making. And a lot of the time with what I found with clients is when they're frightened, when they're difficult, or family members, a lot of the time it's because they don't feel they are part of the decision-making process. Okay. So even if you tell them and they go, I don't know, what should I do? The actual act of saying, you know, here's the options, you know, this is what we would suggest is the best. That just them getting the opportunity to be part of that discussion can often reduce their anxiety significantly. And there's a kind of nature of professional respect. You know, you need to make sure that you're holding yourself and communicating in a way that emanates and illustrates that you are always respectful of whoever you're speaking to or whoever that you are communicating with. And again, that's often based on understanding what different roles and responsibilities are. You know, if you meet your first OT and you don't really know what they do and you start talking about back to work programs, they're probably going to think, wow, you know, this person is not very good at their job. So, you know, if you don't know what somebody else's role or responsibility is, just ask, you know, say, look, I'm really curious. I don't know what an occupational therapist does. Could you maybe tell me? Could you maybe give me some examples? Because everybody likes to talk about themselves. So, you know, maybe the problem you have there is kind of getting away and ending the conversation. So, best practices of working together. Okay, so often transition to home for the elderly. You know, someone going out of the hospital, they need to have a care placement. They need to make sure that all of the services are there, whether it be like Meals on Wheels, there's going to be people providing them food. Maybe they need help with their medication. Maybe they need help with bathing. Maybe they need help with, you know, getting to bed at night or cleaning. There's going to be a whole range of assessment of how capable is this person of looking after themselves independently at home. Maybe it's a mobility issue. Do they need a physio? Do they need a wheelchair? Do they need a walker? Have they had a stroke? Is it a communication issue? Do we need to get the speech and language therapist in? But the health side and the social side, you know, will be working in a joint team to make sure that transition is as easy as possible. Mental health provision certainly is a joint endeavour. You know, because often if someone has significant mental health issues, they also will be in a supported accommodation. And we also have to bear in mind that there will also be a working relationship with the voluntary agencies. So often somebody will be, if they are in a supported accommodation, it will be a voluntary organisation who's providing those services, and health and social care will be going in and out and doing whatever they need to do. So social care will probably be getting the funding together. Voluntary organisation has the placement, they're delivering the project, and then the health service will provide things like the psychologist, the psychiatrist, and everyone's kind of going in around this person. And addiction services, again, you have people that will be in the health service because they're dealing with things like opiate addictions, so they're getting help to be able to how are they going to come off this dependency? What will be the model of doing it? Do they need psychological intervention? Do they need some form of methadone program? In terms of social services, is there children involved? How do we care for them? Are these individuals, are they able to care for themselves? What's their home environment like? So again, a lot of different disciplines, a lot of different sectors working together. So it's really important you understand what sector means. Sector is when it's the difference between something like the health service and the social service. Okay, so they would be two separate sectors. When we're inside, it would be like the health service and their disciplines. The disciplines would be all of the different work roles that you'll find either in health or social care. So how can we improve it? Well, it's really about everyone having an expectation from the get-go that we're going to work in this way. If you go into social care and you think, okay, I'm going to be working in this supported accommodation and it's just going to be me, then it's going to come as a shock to realize at some point, health services are going to be rolling up into your door and coming into your project. Now, on the day-to-day, you may not have a lot of footfall of different disciplines, but if you work in learning disability, for sure, you're going to have OT, speech and language therapists, psychologists. There's going to be people, who are coming in to do assessment, to do intervention working, and it's those opportunities are not a rarity. They're not going to be something that you don't see very often. It's going to be something that happens on a fairly regular basis. So knowing that is a good place to start. You are going to be coming in contact with them. Making sure wherever you work, you understand the communication and the information sharing policies. Anywhere you work, there should be something somewhere that says it. If not, if you can't find it, just ask your line manager, please, can you explain to me how this works? What am I allowed to share? What am I not allowed to share? I'd like either some training or I'd like a conversation so that I can make sure that I know what the rules are. Collaboration and team working. It's great working in teams. I really, really enjoy it. I like doing my own particular part of the work that I do, but I always really enjoy collaborating with somebody else because it allows you to help your client or your patient in a much more holistic way. It allows you, for me personally, I love the opportunity to learn about different people's jobs and the ways that they, get involved with a client. So I have, over my years, I've done shadowing, I've watched OTs, occupational therapists, I've watched physiotherapists, I've watched general practitioners, I've even watched surgeons at work. So any opportunity that you can get to kind of find out what, people do in their different roles is always a particularly valuable and enriching activity because it will improve, your capacity to do your team working. And we set up these multi-agency team meetings and conferences. So it's very, very common that, you know, they'll have a conference on diabetes type 2, for example, and it won't just be nurses that turn up. There'll be a whole range of different disciplines who go because they want to learn what is the latest evidence, what is the latest research for their particular topic. So these are a couple of the guidelines about multi-agency working, the No Secrets Code of Practice, and that's to do with information sharing, and the Care and Statutory Support Guidance. Now, the Care Act. Now, these are all the guidance that basically spell out how are we supposed to share information, how are we supposed to work together. And, you know, I would advise you go and have a look. Even if you only read the executive summary, you know, it's a good idea to have some sense of, you know, what are the rules that you're supposed to be working under. So, okay, how can you improve communication? Well, the first thing is non-verbal communication. I know it sounds kind of stupid, but, you know, a smile is worth $1,000,000. You know, if you are with a patient or a client who's distressed and you are able to remain calm, your body is calm, you're relaxed, you look confident, then that is going to really, really help. Because generally when you have a difficult patient, it's because they're frightened, and what they're really looking for is reassurance. So your capacity to kind of give out a sense of just being stable and being kind of certain, that often is enough to help that person regain a sense of self-control. And as I say, it helps them control their emotions and behaviors. If you too are, you know, if your client is kind of kicking off and they're really upset, and you know, I worked in learning disability for years, so you know, I've seen some fairly extreme behaviors. And you know, if I had responded in kind, it would have been pandemonium. So you know, even when I felt that I was being pushed, when I felt that I was being, you know, that this was more than would be normal, keeping a control or a check on my own emotions and behavior was vital to de-escalate the situation, to keep it in a kind of meaningful and controlled, you know, environment. Now, I've got it on here. Okay, yeah, before we talk about empathy, trust, and I want to talk about touch, because touch is really important, okay? Now, we have to be careful with touch, and the reason is that it depends on our clients, how they feel about it, what you know, what their cultural, their religious you know, beliefs are, and you know, sometimes it's just because of it's a gender issue that, you know, women don't want to be touched by men. So there's a whole range of difficulties. However, bearing all of that in mind, sometimes, you know, touch, like holding someone's hand, sitting close to them, can be a very powerful way to help someone. But if you're going to do it, what you need to do is you need to ask permission first. You need to make sure you say, look, would it help if I sat beside you? Would that make you feel better? What do you think? Okay. So if the person says yeah, then you've asked permission, and that's okay. But you have to be very, very, you know, confident, and you have to be very careful in how you do touch, because, you know, we live in an age where we're not quite sure how someone's going to take it. So we need to make sure. But that would be the same in anything you do. You really want to look and ask for consent. And we'll talk about that in another class. So empathy, trust, and understanding, you know, it's like I said, when you've got for example, you've got a family member who is telling you that they're so tired of having to tell the same story, you know, you just listening to that and saying, you know what, I can completely understand how frustrating that would be. if I was you, I would be feeling the same. Just being able to acknowledge that, their reality, their experience, it can do so much to build the relationship with your client or with another professional. When you say, yeah, I can understand how difficult it is maybe working with this particular client, or how frustrating it is knowing that you can't get the appropriate funding, or whatever it may be. But just allowing yourself to take a minute to empathize with that other person. It builds trust, and it allows that person to start to feel that they're being understood, and that maybe working with you is a good thing. Being able to seek compromise. Some people cannot compromise. It doesn't matter what you say, what you do, it's their way or the highway. That is really not great in partnership working. You want to be able to have a discussion. You want to be able to say, okay, we've got something difficult that's happening, but we need to get to the end of this and make a resolution and a way forward. The communication and being specific and clear, agreed shared guidelines, all of these things, that's why it's so important, because when we're working with somebody else, we cannot assume that they know what we know, and we cannot assume they understand what we're thinking. So when we're very specific, when we're very clear, when we have things written down, then we know that we're reducing the opportunity for misunderstanding. And a lot of partnership working fails because people don't know what each other expects. So they kind of start doing whatever they're doing, work, and then it all goes wrong because actually the reality is, they haven't been very clear from the beginning. Don't accuse people. It would have been all right if you hadn't of blah, 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 blah. Don't do that, okay? It's people generally in the workplace, especially in a health and social care environment, are doing the best they can. And sometimes, it's maybe not as good as it could be. Now, if you've got someone who's repeatedly doing something that is wrong, okay? So they're doing something that's abusive or is so below standard, and it's repeated and it's chronic, that's a different set of considerations. But generally on the day-to-day, most people are doing as much as they can and as well as they can. So sometimes it's just, again, about listening. And when we say active listening, it doesn't just mean like kind of letting the person drone on and you zone out. It's actually taking part and making sure you're hearing what they say, because people will generally tell you what it is that they're struggling with or what it is they need help with. And always, get support, get some advice about how to do it better. You're always going to be, from the beginning that you start work to the day that you kind of, go, hey, I'm now retired, you are going to be learning new things, growing, and you're always going to be facing new challenges. Health and social care are, if nothing else, are a constant, invitation to go into new situations that you never thought you'd be in, facing events that you never thought you'd see, and going, how do I deal with this new thing? Okay, there is pretty much little predictability. There's always going to be something new, always. You think you've kind of, you've worked it all out, and then something else happens and you're like, oh wow, okay, wow, what's this? How do I deal with this? And that's one of the great things about partnership working, because there's a really good chance that somebody you work with has seen it, has faced it, and maybe has some suggestions. And you just got to make sure you know what the boundaries are. You have to know, where do we start? Where do we end? Where do you start? And that helps, because then everybody feels respected in their own specific discipline, and you're not making unreasonable demands on them, and they're not going to make unreasonable demands on you. So that's the end of this. So we're going to quickly go over what the assignment for this is, for this module. And basically you've got a presentation and a report to do. So this will be loaded up. I'm fingers crossed it's recorded okay. So it will be loaded up. Tasnuva will do it, and I'll give you all of the slides so that you'll be able to see all of the things, that we've covered. But when you're doing your assignment, you need to make sure you're going to cover what the roles and responsibilities. You need to make sure you specifically say what the differences in the working relationships are in comparison to professional. Explain the role of the regulators and advisors, why it's important to follow agreed ways of working, how to get the access, where are the details of this, and how to contribute to the quality assurance processes. Okay, so the quality assurance processes is basically being part of these multidisciplinary teams doing your partnership working to make sure that you're an active part in the development of new practice and best practice. Okay, so it's going to be a presentation file, speaker notes, 500 words, and an accompanying report. That's not going to include your diagrams, your references, and your appendices. Now, the second task is you're going to be prepared for an interview. So you're going to explain the benefits. So you're going to be able to talk about why partnership working is a good idea, what happens in health and social care. And you're going to be able to describe some of the best practices. So you're going to be able to talk about, here are some projects where they have shown how they work together. Okay. And then just what things can we do about in the way that we work that can improve these partnership workings? What is it we can do? Okay. So you need to be able to cite your references. So I would suggest that you Google how to do Harvard referencing to make sure if you haven't done it before, and it will give you examples of how you pull that together. And then this is the evidence that you need to submit. So Tasnuva will no doubt go over all of this with you. Now, these are some of the suggested reading that I think are of particular use. The ones that have got asterisks beside them, these you can download in PDF format for free on the internet. So when you go and look these up, you're going to be able to find them quite easily. Now, I'm not giving you the whole book to read. It's only chapters. So, it's fairly straightforward. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 chapters that you can get for free that you'll be able to, quickly go over all of the stuff we've talked to today, which is going to help you when you start to write, your essay, when you're going to do your presentation. But remember, within the slides, I've specifically made sure that I've gone over all of the points that you need to cover. So the information and the structure is pretty much already in there. Okay, so if anyone has any questions that they particularly want me to answer, this is the email address that I have, and you just in the subject line, if you put the module, so if it's module 1, then you've got the question, you put your module 1 and then put your name, and then I'll reply within 72 hours. Okay, so it won't necessarily be straight away, but I will do it, as quickly as I can. So that is everything for right now. Now, has anyone got any questions? Because we've actually got a bit of time because we started on time. So has anyone got any questions? Anything they didn't understand? You can put your cameras on, maybe we can have a chat. If anyone wants to be seen. Is anybody there? Have you all died? No? Hello? They've got one. Cool. Okay, I'm just going to make sure I stop the recording. There we go.